Shall we begin?
Yes.
Just jump right into it?
All right. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Hi everyone. The current title of my thesis is On the Spectacle, Creating Narratives Through Landscape Monument. The 1980s cult classic They Live opens with the narrative of the movie in an actual homeless shelter settlement in Los Angeles. Through the lens of Roddy Piper's character Nada, John Carpenter offers a critique on social inequality and the urban environment. Nada discovers a pair of sunglasses capable of showing the world for what it truly is. As he walks the streets of LA, Nada notices that both the media and the government are comprised of subliminal messages meant to keep the population subdued. The upper middle class consists of aliens trying to exploit the poor by redirecting their consciousness with preoccupations of material things, working 9 to 5, getting married, having babies, and consumption. With this shocking discovery, Nada fights to free humanity from the mind-controlling aliens. While an entertaining film, Carpenter's critique on advertisement and politics as modern-day propaganda is relevant today. As a result, I began to ask questions about the nature of perception and subliminal messages in the built environment. As emotional beings, we locate our perceptual consciousness to the places we find ourselves both spatially and temporally. Historically, the architect's job has been to help us feel at home in the city, to intensify our sense of self and belonging through the institutions that frame our daily lives. However, the characters in They Live feel just the opposite. The urban environment is a place for Nada to hide from the power structures that don't want him to see. The sunglasses then become a threshold for Nada, a portal that allows him to see and perceive things he could not see before. I began to ask myself a set of questions. Who is the urban environment designed for? And if we can localize our perceptions to the spaces we occupy, then how do these spaces influence how and what we perceive? And lastly, what is our version of Carpenter's eye-opening sunglasses? This presentation will be divided into 4 parts. Part 1, perception, Part 2, the spectacle, Part 3, the stage, and Part 4, landscape monument. The neurophysiological process of perception can be thought of as an activity that occurs independently inside our brains. However, philosopher Alva Noah argues that we should not think of perception, consciousness, or experience as something that happens inside of us. Instead, we should think of perception as an activity we enact or perform. If perception is an activity that allows us to navigate our environment through the senses, then one can say that we achieve access to the world by enacting ourselves. For us to perceive something, it must first be present for us. Perception is not so much a matter of existence, but a matter of availability. We can only understand something based on our lived experience, education, and language. Imagine for a second that you're in an art gallery. You are walking through displays of art that you don't necessarily have an affinity for. Perhaps the colors are dull, or the depictions seem too ancient to relate to. No matter, the paintings don't capture your attention, and without giving another thought, you move on looking for something more compelling. I have been guilty of dismissing work simply because I did not know it. I visited the Art Institute of Chicago a few years ago. One painting that did not grab my attention at the time was A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of Le Grand Jatte by Georges Seurat. I glanced at it, recognized Seurat's name and something about pointillism, but lacking enough curiosity to investigate further, I kept walking and carried on with my visit. Years later, I come back to the painting because I now see something in it that I could not see then. A Sunday Afternoon is a painting that depicts French bourgeois in the late 1800s. It portrays fashionable Parisians enjoying their Sunday afternoon by a river. Seurat has arranged the depicted Parisians in static groups across the composition. These high society Parisians appear to be frozen in time, like in a dreamlike state. Their positions on the landscape carefully choreographed, and their gazes meticulously directed. The painting emanates a performative atmosphere that criticizes the materialistic values of the bourgeois and their obsession with appearances during the industrial era. As an object, A Sunday Afternoon was a painting that was not there for me to perceive because I didn't know it. However, during my research during my thesis research, I came across this painting once more, and with a new set of eyes, its perceptual presence became available for me. I now see the relevance of its historical context to modern day's digital revolution. Today, we are constantly immersed in visual culture. Through television, movies, the internet, advertising, social media, and other forms of corporate production, we measure our opinion and perceptions by the established and accepted notion that appearances matter more than lived experience. I now see this interpretation not because the painting changed, but because there was a change in me. According to Alvano, art has the power to disrupt habits and provide us with an opportunity to become aware, and I agree. However, we must first make the decision to go to the art gallery to encounter this opportunity. I think architecture as a practice has this power as well, except with the difference that architecture surrounds us. And so I began to ask myself, what happens in the moment of realization when we go from not seeing to seeing? Theorist Francois Bonnet calls this moment the space of the sensible. Think of this place as a figurative liminal space that we occupy momentarily to create a reading between object and self. Lived experience, education, and language are power structures that mediate this space. Have you ever had an opinion about something you have never experienced firsthand? A sort of loop phenomenon occurs when our perceptions are mediated by preconceived notions of experience established by symbols and systems. But sometimes a curious thing occurs, a moment of transformation where an event disrupts the cycle and as a result engenders a new way of seeing. I became really interested in the relationship between disruption and mediation. I began to realize the controversial power behind mediation. I'm sure most of us know what the sign on the trash bag means, and most of us don't need to open the trash bag to find out. While mediation can be useful to guide us and keep us safe, it can also be used as a tool for control. And so if perception is something that can be routed, then consciousness now becomes a major stake. At the source, a spectacle is an object or event of curiosity or contempt. In Society of the Spectacle, Guy Debord reinterprets the word to criticize a society governed by symbols. He defines the spectacle as a social relation among people mediated by images. As a form of control, the spectacle is so intertwined in our culture that it is difficult to separate it from life. Entertainment has become a way for us to consume. Can we imagine a world where not all leisure is consumption? The problem with the spectacle as a form of control is that it is a product of the economy. Our attention, consumption, and satisfaction is an expense required to maintain passive consumers rather than participating citizens. And so, investigating the spectacle as a form of control, I began to wonder about its roots. Up until the 1920s, goods and services were advertised to people based on their basic needs. After World War I, corporations became more rich and they began to worry about overproduction. Using Sigmund Freud's studies on psychoanalysis, Edward Bernays saw an opportunity to increase corporate revenue by appealing to people's desires instead of their needs. This is a timeline of where the spectacle, as Guy Debord defines it, originated. In 1905, Sigmund Freud published 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. In his research, Freud identified people as irrational beings that act on impulsive and unconscious motives. People cannot be trusted to make decisions for their well-being, and so they must be guided. Inspired by his uncle's research, Edward Bernays began to wonder if propaganda could be used in times of war, could it also be used in times of peace? Could he appeal to people's fears and desires to manipulate them into buying his ideas? And so, to test his hypothesis, Bernays experimented with a campaign. During the 1920s, it was taboo for women to smoke in public. Lucky Strike realized that they were missing out on half their market, and so they sought out for Bernays' help. Bernays paid a group of women to march smoking openly at the Easter Day Parade in New York City. He then tipped off the New York Times that he had heard a group of suffragettes would be protesting at the parade. The event became known as Torches of Freedom. Through this campaign, Bernays was able to successfully connect feminine freedom, independence, and empowerment to women smoking cigarettes. I became interested in the strategies of campaigns. I define a campaign as a rule that appeals to the collective spheres or desires for the economic benefit of an elite group of people. I categorize campaigns under 3 types: products, politics, and landscapes. And while there are many examples, I will only mention a few for the sake of time. We have all heard growing up from our parents or even our teachers that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. You might be surprised, just as I was, to find out this idea was a result of a campaign during the 1930s. In that time, the sale of bacon was at an all-time low. Bernays was hired to increase sales. Through questionnaires, he found out that most Americans had a piece of toast and a cup of coffee for breakfast. Bernays then surveyed doctors and asked them, is it healthier to eat a hearty breakfast or light breakfast? They answered hearty, and so Bernays interpreted this in his own way. Bacon and eggs are hearty, bacon and eggs, the all-American breakfast. And so it's interesting to see how we still buy into a narrative that was created so long ago. To quote Bernays, politics was the first big business in America. Business has learned everything that politics has had to teach, but politics has failed to learn very much from business methods of mass distribution of ideas and products. This might have been true during that time, but it is no longer the case. With time, politics has very much learned from the business methods of propaganda, and I want to focus specifically on Donald Trump because of his relevancy to the subject. As a businessman and our president, Donald Trump sits at the perfect intersection between business and politics. He is familiar with propaganda strategies used to appeal to consumers. Throughout his campaign and presidency, Trump has used tactics that appeal to people's fear. To him, Americans are not citizens, but consumers. And as consumers, he can sell us his message by employing tactics that appeal to our fears instead of our rationality. The performance is his language of grievance, and Twitter is his stage. And lastly, the landscape. I want to talk about landscape as a category of campaigns. For the sake of time, I'm only going to focus on monuments. Most of Confederate monuments were erected as political props between the 1890s and 1930s. Monuments tend to come from attempts by political or business elite to reinforce and invigorate their claim to authority. When we commemorate historical happenings and figures in public spaces, we are essentially telling future generations what should matter to them and who they should hold in high esteem. The recent removal of several Jim Crow monuments has revealed deep-seated divisions in our communities, but it also sparked important conversations about the ties between systems and symbols, the links between past and present, the differences in how we perceive our built environment, and the narratives we create and remember. The image to the right is a Confederate statue that was recently taken down during a protest in Durham, North Carolina. I realized that if a Confederate statue is a spectacle as a form of control, then the taking down of the statue is a spectacle too, but as a form of resistance. I became interested in the mark that's left behind by this act of resistance. I began to ask myself another set of questions. How does the absence of the monument give presence to the scar where the monument once stood? How does this new space now become a place for transformation? Can this event become an opportunity for people to find themselves exhibited and as a result see things in ways they could not before? And so with these questions, I began to wonder about my own backyard. Part 3, the stage. I define the stage as the third space. It is the shared space we occupy when we are not at work or home. I call it the stage because it's a space for enactment and transformation. The stage is a liminal space constructed by its participants. It's a space of negotiation between boundaries and our perceptions. To quote critical theorist Homi Bhabha, the third space is a fantastic location of cultural difference where new expressive cultural identities continually open out performatively to realign the boundaries of class, race, and of gender, contingent upon chunks of inconsumable elements of the past, totalized identity. I recently moved to Boston and like many others have witnessed the acts of resistance around Black Lives Matter in the recent months. As I walked through Copley Square a few months ago, I began to wonder about other spectacles of resistance that took place before my time. In my research, I found pictures of protests from the civil rights movement and mapped them out in a collage. I mapped out Boston Common and the streetscapes surrounding it. I then collaged the spectacles of resistance along with my own experiences walking through Copley Square, up Boylston Street, and into Boston Common. I realized that the connecting thread among these events was not only time, but also Boston Common as a stage that transforms into a place for synthesis. 3 different systems emerge as a result of this experience. I call these systems characters of the spectacle. The first character is the archon. The archon is the character who creates the parameters of the spectacle. This role sets the infrastructure and frames the daily experiences of the other characters. The archon engages in the spectacle to exercise control. Examples of the archon can be politicians, corporations, and the top 1%. The second character is the spectator. The spectator plays the role of a passive consumer. They exist and are complacent within the boundaries the archon creates. They trust authority figures to advocate for their needs. The spectator engages in the spectacle to be entertained. They can be told who they are, what they want, and what they need. And finally, there's the actor. The actor is a critical citizen who participates in the spectacle to enact change and awareness. They take it upon themselves to figure out what they value, want, and need. The stage of transformation is the actor's liminal position. They engage in the spectacle to blur the archon's boundaries and negotiate the narratives that the archon creates. Examples of the actor can be graffiti artists, street performers, designers, architects, and activists, such as Martin Luther King Jr., Colin Kaepernick, Banksy, and many others. In the case of the movie They Live, the aliens are the archons, the people who can't see are the spectators, and Nada is the actor. And so thinking about these characters, I became interested in the role of the actor. I began to dissect the collage and cut sections into specific moments where spectacles over systems overlapped. I then overlaid and juxtaposed these moments as a way to study the temporal character of the transient state of liminality. I became curious about the stage as a liminal space that framed these moments, and so I decided to explode the layers to investigate further. I transposed the sectional vignettes onto plexi and layered them one in front of the other to experience their spatial relation and tension. I realized that the liminal space between each panel allude to Francois Bonnet's space of the sensible. These strange in-between slots become thresholds of subdued light and shadow, where one layer reveals sight of the next. Light traverses the open spaces and the solid areas cast shadow on the space in between. Here, the shadows merge and build on each other. I examined the possibilities of creating a stage that could be filled with interaction of light and shadow, of borders and its occupants. Part 4, Landscape Monument. Sorry. I want to go back to the topic of landscape as spectacle and introduce the idea of a landscape monument. Monuments are the interpretations of collective memory and convey carefully choreographed narratives created by those who erected them. They can be considered a spectacle because they narrate history in selective and controlled ways, hiding as much as they reveal. A cultural landscape can be perceived in the same way an architectural monument. The urban and suburban context, for example, store the memory of all the decisions made both at the micro and macro scale. The past is imprinted in the urban fabric and interpreted physically through social institutions. These interpretations eventually become part of the collective memory of the people who occupy these spaces. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt enacted the New Deal as a response to the hardships Americans faced during the Great Depression. A series of programs, public work projects, financial reforms, and regulations were established to recover the American economy and avoid any future depressions. Among these programs were the Federal Housing Government Agency, the FHA, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation, also known as HOLC. The purpose of HOLC was to provide emergency relief with respect to home mortgage indebtedness and to carry out provisions of the Act. As a strategy for economic recovery, HOLC recruited mortgage lenders, developers, and real estate appraisers to create security maps of neighborhoods that color-coded worthiness and risk. The green zones are the best neighborhoods, the blue zones are still desirable, the yellow zones definitely declining, and the red zones are hazardous. And right now I'm talking about the map to the left. One of the biggest considerations that impacted worthiness of a neighborhood was the presence of or proximity to a Negro section. The presence of African Americans minorities, and immigrants would undermine the value of the landscape. These maps would predict the trend of desirability for the future and become an instrument for segregation as a political practice. These maps not only codified patterns of racial segregation, they also created disparities in access to credit. People of color had to live in specific neighborhoods because of restricted community covenants, but they couldn't buy in the neighborhoods they could live in because the FHA would not secure a mortgage in a hazardous or declining zone. To the left is a security map of Boston's during the 1930s. To the right is a census map from 2010. Though segregation is no longer a matter of policy, we can see that the security map predictions were a self-fulfilled prophecy. The stark similarities between the two maps brought up a series of questions in my research. How does history imprint itself on the landscape? And how does collective memory affect our perceptions as individuals in the urban context? And lastly, does it take deliberate intention for a narrative to survive? And if you look at the areas that I've sort of highlighted in the maps, on the left, that's Roxbury, that was definitely declining during the 1930s. And to the right, you see that the biggest population of African Americans are currently living in that area. And so with these questions, I decided to zoom in and look at one of Boston's historic neighborhoods, the West End. This is a map of what the West End looks like today. It's bounded generally by Charles River to the west, Cambridge Street to the south, and Washington Street on the northeast, and Newbury Street to the east. Today, it's mostly dominated with high-rises, business buildings, and Mass General Hospital. But from the early to mid-1900s, the West End was a vibrant and diverse low-income residential neighborhood. Its population at the time consisted of 11% Black and 33% immigrants. In the 1950s, cities like Boston were worried about the flight of the middle and upper classes to the suburbs. Urban renewal projects became a way to displace the lower class from urban neighborhoods in the hope of attracting the middle class and its money back to the city. The Hulk maps assessed the West End as hazardous and targeted the zone for an urban renewal project that would bring the upper classes back into the city. The goal was a homogeneous neighborhood, and the West End, a melting pot diverse in culture, was the complete opposite of that. I began to think about the West End as a stage where its occupants became actors, and their mere coexistence blurred the boundaries the Archon created through the Hulk security maps. But the city took the land, demolished 900 buildings, and turned most of the site over to a developer to be redesigned. These are images of before and after, and I think it helps us understand the scale of the urban renewal project. Though the West End was labeled a slum, its occupants will tell you otherwise. To this day, the surviving occupants remain a community. Though displaced and scattered throughout Boston, they keep in contact and organize events every month to get together and reminisce fondly about their old lives in the West End. They even have a newsletter and museum dedicated to the old neighborhood that is now just a memory. At the West End Museum, you can watch interviews with the surviving residents and hear them talk about their childhoods. One resident says he loved the smell of linoleum stored under his apartment. Another recites a poem in which she talks about tasty sauce filling our home with wonderful scents. Others reminisce about Polish, Russian, and Italian bread. They say that you could smell the dishes from all different cultures as you climb the stairs of the apartment building. They talk about what a great place it was to grow up. And I began to wonder, how is it that half a century later, these memories of a place that no longer exists can be so durable? How is it that the surviving occupants still feel like they are members of the West End? To further understand the social constructs created within the boundaries of this neighborhood, I decided to revisit the plexi vignettes that I layered one in front of the other. But this time I rendered specific memories from photographs of life in the West End. I stitched them together like an accordion book so that the memories become bounded and frozen in time. With the help of light, each panel begins to inform the next, until what you have is a spectacle of light and shadow casted on the ground. The panels embrace the space in between like brackets enclose supplementary information in a sentence. The shadows casted by the memories envelop the accordion panels to create the illusion of rooms in which we can imagine these memories playing out. Sociologist Maurice Halbwachs explains the impact that landscape has on our collective memory. He says, when a group has lived a long time in a place and adapted to its habits, its thoughts as well as its movements are in turn ordered by the succession from these external objects. Though the West End is no longer a place, its memory is embodied not just in the mind, but in the material structure and makeup of the city, and so it serves as an image that exerts itself on the collective memory. We could say the same thing about segregation. Though redlining is no longer practiced, those decisions are indexed in the DNA of the urban fabric, like memories ingrained in our minds. I became interested in the idea of a city as an index, a mold that takes shape from the decisions made over time. I began to wonder how these decisions affect the collective memory and perceptions of its occupants. Which parts of history are imprinted on our psyche and which parts are forgotten? I go back to the idea of the spectacle and its relationship to monument. The West End has been monumentalized in space and in memory, just as segregation practices have been monumentalized in space and memory. Through this plaster construct, I experimented with the idea of monumentalism and how a series of events can permanently embed itself in a mold by burying the accordion panels into a plaster context. I then burned off the panels, leaving the plaster context with an index of memories. However, it's impossible to read the entirety of the panels once they're burned off. There are only clues from which to rebuild. Fragmented truths forever imprinted on the context. I'm currently looking to make a series of diagrams from this model in hopes that it will further help me understand the relationship between spectacle and landscape monument and how to use the spectacle as a tool to create architectural and social conditions like in the West End. And that's all I have for now.
Thank you, Jerry. That was a terrific presentation. So, Nancy.
Hi, Jerry. Yeah, that was beautiful. Very well done. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, great.
I have posted my Miro board on the bottom if you guys want to look at it. Do I need to post it again? Yeah.
Okay, Jerry, question for you. The very last thing you said, you want to create architectural installations likened to the West End story that you told, the narrative of the West. Can you elaborate a little bit more about what your intentions are?
Yeah, I want to make diagrams based on the constructs that I made in an effort to try to understand how social and architectural conditions come together to create a community like that. And I guess in doing so, I would also be looking into how segregation, even though it's no longer practiced, how the memory of that, along with the memory of good things like this community, this really strong community that existed in the West End, are embedded into the DNA of our city, and so they affect our perceptions, our daily perceptions as individuals.
And are you? And I think that's a good step to take to see what are the components that go into making a place like that. But if I look at your thesis overall, I would maybe guess that there would be a slightly different direction, which would be actually not so much trying to recreate that place or places like that, but trying to find ways that you might work with the memory of places, just because you were dealing with this strong idea of embedded memories, right? The idea of the index of things that are contained in places, both good and bad. And then also the idea of the void left by the ruined monument, or the monument that's been removed, right? And so then I think to myself, also looking at your layered spatial constructs and the idea of the space in between, the idea of the liminality, and kind of ideas of memory and habitation. And I think to myself that you're perhaps making something or exploring something that is not necessarily just a pure condition or a new condition entirely, but is some kind of a hybrid, or and also contains shadows, echoes, memories, right, that become reconfigured or maybe become tangible again or accessed again. Mm-hmm. And then also there's the question of kind of how you do that through some kind of participation, all right, the enacting of something, that idea of that activist or that active participant. And my question, I guess, is who is that now in this project going forward? So that's my next question for you. Who is that actor in this project of somehow recreating, and I'll oversimplify it just so we can be kind of clear about what I'm asking, but recreating the West End, right? But I know that's not exactly what you want to do, but in that case, then who must the actors be besides yourself?
I think the actors are anyone who's willing to look at the history of our country honestly, and being able to read the context, not just through their own perspective, but through the perspective of people who have come before them and who are people whose experiences are different than their own.
Is there a way that you'll be able to kind of maybe catalog or index, as you say, some of those experiences and make them a part of the program of the thing that you're designing?
Catalog individual experiences?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You obviously have kind of accessed them through this museum of the West End, which probably is a great resource for you.
Yeah, I got to watch a lot of interviews of, now most of the people who live there are really old, but and even though I didn't interview them myself, it was really enlightening to see how much they still feel a part of this community and how vivid their memories are. Mm-hmm. And I told you before that I reached out to Giordana. She's the head of the archive department at Northeastern University, and I haven't contacted her yet about getting me in touch with community leaders so that I can talk to specific people and interview them, just because I wanted to be at a good place where I had enough work to show her so I can actually have a conversation with her. Yeah. But I think I'm now at a place where I can talk to her and kind of show her where my project is heading.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts about the landscape monument more specifically as something that you might be kind of designing maybe at a location in the West End? Is that something that you're thinking about?
I hadn't thought about that.
Well, you're making this plaster field condition.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that you are considering the possibility, or at least, I mean, I would imagine you would want to consider this as an option. You might not go with this direction, but you should certainly think it over of whether it makes sense within your project to actually create a space, some kind of an active public space within the West End that holds these memories.
I guess I hadn't considered it, but it's definitely something to think about because I'm kind of already doing that in a more speculative way.
Mm-hmm.
I think that up until this point, I've been more interested in investigating how memories become imprinted on the city and how these decisions of the past are all sort of stored in these physical structures that, you know, we occupy every day.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe that is something that I could do. I could probably get.
I love the kind of memory palace accordion panels. I think that that's something to continue to work on. And you said they create the illusion of rooms, right? And so I think that through further development of that particular direction, wow, I really love this idea of making more of these memory panels and taking us into those spaces and those memories very visually, you know, and then I don't know how they might evolve, but they, you know, is there a possibility that they could be constructed and inhabited, or is it okay for them to remain as drawings or as other kinds of media? Perhaps they could even include moving images or something. And are they temporary? You know, are they permanent? So I have some questions like that. The plaster takes me to a place that feels kind of heavy and permanent, like you're sort of marking the ground and laying down and removing layers even as you kind of add in other or return certain kinds of stories and layers to the landscape. So it could be that there's both, you know, there's sort of some moves that you make that sort of are permanent marks, you know, or as permanent as we can be in the context and the site of the West End, and other things are maybe meant to be experienced, you know, as an installation or something that travels or moves or has a certain impermanence to it. So I see two really different things, kind of the permanent and the impermanent, and the two main things that you've made so far, which are the heavy plaster piece and then the very light and temporal, in some ways kind of intangible or less tangible, but very experienced, you know, very emotive pieces in the layered sectional vignettes and the kind of resultant kind of roomscapes that emerge from them.
As I was building the memories, I did begin to imagine. I did begin to look at it as rooms, the way that the accordion folds and creates like these rooms between each one. And I did think about how cool would it be if it was like at human scale and then people could come and like look into these memories.
Yeah.
And I thought, you know, maybe I could do something like that using cardboard, because that would be easy for me to use, lacking a sort of studio setting. And then I also thought about what if I like made it digital, because I mean, most times during these sort of projects, people propose, you know, buildings and stuff like that, and they never build it one-to-one. So I could digitize it and create like.
Can I jump in there? I don't want to talk over you guys because this is really productive, but you know, responding to a bunch of things that Nancy was saying and responding to that comment in particular. So if I'm looking at, well, if you guys are looking at Miro, I'm just going to grab your cursor for a minute. So your title on Spectacle, Creating Narrative Through Landscape Monument, it seems to me the way that you two are both talking about this, it isn't, we're not talking about monuments. This is anti-monumentalism, right? You're talking about memories of a place broken up into little chunks that are completely dependent on sort of location and who was there, right? So if it is a monument, it's a pretty evanescent monument, right? It's extremely time limited, right? Which it seems to me, which is largely, it's kind of largely what you're doing. And then I noticed over here for the first time that that you use this term memory palace, and I hadn't noticed that before. But so when someone says memory palace to me, I immediately think of the method of loci, right? Which is Cicero's method of memorizing anything, speeches, long lists. It's also called the memory palace. It's the method of places in which you use a memory of a specific place as an indexical reference for specific things that you need to remember, right? So you want to remember somebody's name, think of what that name makes you think of inside your childhood house, and you place it on a shelf and you just remember where you put it, right? It's a method of memorization. And so when I saw this title over your fold out thing here, it occurs to me that the type of monument you seem to be talking about is more about remembering the place than it is about memorializing something that's gone, right? So like a landscape monument seems to me is often about something that's lost. It's a memory of things that have gone, right? A memory of specifically like dead things, dead soldiers, like people who sacrificed, that sort of thing, right? But what you're talking about has more to do, I think, with life, with the kind of vibrancy that of a neighborhood in particular, right? And then when you start talking about this idea that maybe the thing that you're making is a digital thing, then I get really excited, because first of all, we have this opportunity here. We've got this virtual format. You can make almost anything at all. And as you were presenting, your presentation was so good. I thought, well, this is a first-class lecture, right? It could be a short film, right? But what if what you're doing is curating virtual versions of these things through this sort of mapping presence in a kind of hyperlinked way, right? The same way, if I'm reading a document online and you mentioned some of your references and that you'd seen read a lecture or you watched a video a couple times, right? If we're looking at this on Miro, those links can be there, and I, from this end, can link through them and watch videos and things like that, right? It could turn into a sort of interactive device with multiple levels of active and passive. Like sometimes it proceeds through the slides and talks with pauses, and you can, it's less of a linear thing than a circular thing, because you can click on something and move around the piece. And so the sort of like what is the word Nancy used? It was basically amounting to extremely temporary monumentalism. I forgot exactly how Nancy put it, but it was great. I should have written it down. Would really be embodied by that kind of virtual approach, especially when you're punctuating it with these contemplations you're making on specific moments in the neighborhood that you're building into these things, right? There can be real artifacts, right? So imagine if this were a product. That's kind of the mode I'm in, right? Where you're moving through this presentation of an idea, and you sort of click through these spots on the map where these moments are monumentalized, and maybe somewhere there is actual real artifacts. So like Nancy says, if it's about building something in the city, maybe the kind of memory palace you're building is based on the place itself. I mean, it can be as simple as a plaque on the wall, right? It can be as immersive as, looking through a window or entering a space and seeing a video like an exhibit. There can be a number of these things, small, little, sort of pointed moments that you can access by either being there or by being virtually there, or a combination of both, right? So that's what was going through my head while you guys were just talking.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a wonderful way to proceed. And one of the things I wanted to say also is I think that you've created such a strong foundation for the project that you can be totally free now in making this project, just, developing something out of it. So in a way, you have everything you need already, right? Everything's there. The story behind it, the relevance, it's all very clear and very powerful. And now, right? And it's waiting for you to begin this project. And so I think you can use the remainder of the term to move forward, very comfortably. And I love Mark's suggestions that perhaps the plaster construct is this kind of maybe ever evolving map, right? And with maybe certain physical things embedded in it that one could actually physically go and find within the West End, right? If you want to kind of narrow it to that, or you could expand it beyond there to different points within Boston. But I do also like this idea of a different kind of map, and that you're critiquing the kind of determinism of the red line maps, right? The housing maps that, have sort of laid over so much onto our world, very, very particular points of view of sort of what makes a place desirable or what makes a place valuable. And I think you can make this great kind of opposition to the red line map, with this other kind of map, right? Yeah. And so where they find, like manicured lawns to be something valuable, you find, the smell of beans cooking in a pot to be what makes something really valuable, or the smell of the linoleum shop, below your window, or whatever these things are. And so I think to map those things, map those moments, right? It could come from a combination too. You could enact the collection of those memories by asking people to share their memories, right? Their powerful memories of what makes a place great to grow up in. And so, but I very much like that I wouldn't bother trying to make full-scale constructs out of cardboard at all. I'd rather you draw us into these places through some other medium. And I also wanted to say, though, something that I think is kind of important. It's not so much, that you need to create another museum of the West End through these. What's more important is that you're kind of putting us in contact with the key principles and ideas of your project, which is that you're compelling us to not be spectators, but to be actors somehow. So it's very important that your work not necessarily teach me something about the West End, that's fine, but it needs to do something more, which is to kind of enable this idea of being someone who connects with history in a different way, who critiques, right, and doesn't take things at face value and so forth, and however you do that. But by taking me into these spaces virtually and then giving me a certain kind of way to read them or to navigate them, right, might actually connect me to powerful memories of my own.
I think it'd be cool to do that, like if it's going to be digital, it could be a sort of website with like an interactive sort of map. You just click on things in the website and it zooms you into that's what I imagine whenever you guys talk about.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is there, typically these kinds of websites, they're all over the place. You can find these kinds of things. But what you bring that's a little bit different is that maybe when the image, the photograph, or the text, or whatever someone's contributing, right, whenever it's plugged in, it gets plugged into something more three-dimensional, right, into one of these kind of memory rooms, right? Okay. So that's what kind of excites me. Normally people, okay, here's a link, here's a hyperlink to this photograph, and here's a caption about it. But what if when you link to something, or what if when something was just simply brought in or contributed, it wasn't a singular thing, it was an interwoven thing. So somehow you have some kind of a framework or an infrastructure, and it might be perspectival, so that texts and photographs feel more lived and less two-dimensional, right? And so perhaps you fold the contributions that you're receiving. And I think you can collect your own too from your own photographs, and you sort of have to start with your own stuff and the stuff from the archive. But I think you can begin to have places where other things can get plugged in.
It would be really cool if I could get access to like an empty, like a huge empty white room, and then be able to, with using a projector to cast projections of these different memory rooms, and then you could like walk through it.
You want it to be actually something then that's kind of an installation that's, yeah.
I like the idea of making it digital because it feels more like I can actually do that.
How about this? Here's a compromise. Build it in 3 dimensions digitally, and then treat the walkthrough with, camera fly through, and project the images on the wall just like you would, and so forth, right?
Yeah.
It's basically becomes a proposal.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't mean that you can't someday, actually install this, in a space.
Right.
It could be installed in a space at some later date,
Okay. Yeah, that sounds fun.
Yeah, it's great stuff.
Thank you.
I don't know if any of the others, there's so many in the audience, that would like to comment. We have time. I'd love to hear from some of you guys here in the audience. Who's out there? Jason? There's a lot of people here. Who else is here? I'll call on somebody. Austin. Austin.
Well, in any case, the presentation was, I thought, phenomenal. And after this, let's Zoom so I can walk you through in detail just a couple of fussy things, and we can talk more about this.
Okay, sounds good.
Great. You guys sure you don't want to say anything in the audience? Are you actually listening? Are you there? Austin?
I think it's a shy crowd today.
Elizabeth?
I had a pretty intense presentation earlier myself, so I'm just kind of tired.
He did. It was pretty great.
Like, I did everything in one breath, so I'm...
Yeah, my mouth got really cottony towards the end.
Yeah.
Did you feel that, because I basically took whatever spiel I had for my MP1 presentation and just sort of added to that. I didn't really take anything away. Do you feel like there's anything from the earlier part of the presentation that is now sort of obsolete and I need to take away?
That's a good question. You will have to compress it a little bit because by the time you get to the final, you're going to have more stuff to talk about.
Yeah.
So you'll have to find a way to compress a little. I don't know. I'd have to really go back point by point. For me, it was, but I have been listening to it a few times. So a fresh ears on that might help.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, it seemed like a pretty cohesive essay to me.
Yes, it will be hard to cut something out. There's Bob.
Hi guys.
Yeah, I'll have to figure out how to cut it down.
I had something. I think like the presentation went really well. I was curious, how did you do the plexi pieces? Like, how did you kind of transcribe the diagrams onto the plexiglass?
So before I made the plexi pieces, I made a collage out of I mapped out different protests throughout history, specifically during the civil rights movement. And what I found out is that all of the different pictures that I found from these different protests, they all overlapped in the same spaces. So these couple of streets that lead up to this really big park in Boston called Boston Common. And so from that, I decided that it would be cool to cut sections into areas where these different protests overlapped one another. And so that's how the plexi pieces came about.
Awesome.
Well,
Yeah, I mean, I might have thought that protest would have been something that would have figured a little bit larger, and maybe it will as you move forward.
yeah, I mean, there's so many ways to expand it, like speculating on what happens now when, for example, you look at New York City and there's this massive real estate crush outside of, you know, the borders of Manhattan as people like flee the pandemic, basically, or try to find, you know, more comfortable, you know, sort of quarantine zones. What will happen to the city then? And there's interesting parallels with some of the stuff that you talked about, and you kind of have to speculate on what the results will be.
Mm.
One more example of, you know, this sort of punctuated moment of the flight of wealth from a very dense place.
Yeah.
Flight of wealth, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and that's basically why the West End was demolished, was because the city was trying to bring back the wealth to the city after people had, the middle and upper class had left.
Have you seen that sequence of Nolly maps from Detroit? I think the book it's in Stalking Detroit by Jason Young, I think. It shows the city at its wealthiest peak, as a map, just black and white, bigger ground, and then over ensuing decades, after the riots, after the white flight, and how many of the buildings sort of disappeared slowly, and the sort of dense urban character of the place becomes roughly kind of suburban, right? And then when you look at that from the ground instead of from the map, and you watch now as there's corporate farms in downtown Detroit, it's a completely different place because there's so many big open spaces.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of things to talk about, but yeah, you wonder what will happen now after this. Will people go back? I don't know.
It's a good question.
Well, thanks, Jerry. Great
Thank you for
presentation.
coming.
I'm really looking forward to just a very robust, couple of months here as you embark fully on the realization of these worlds.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, great. Good job.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks a
Thank you
lot.